The first thing you learn after years behind a courtroom bench is that people reveal who they truly are long before the verdict is spoken. Sometimes it happens in a whisper, sometimes it happens in a glance, and sometimes it happens in a single sentence that hangs in the air like smoke. I still remember the exact words that started this story. The young man standing in front of my bench that morning said very calmly, "Judge, my family's foundation funds half the charities in this city. I doubt anyone here wants to turn this into a bigger problem than it needs to be." He said it the way someone states the weather, not angry, not loud, just confident. Confident that the room would understand what he meant. Confident that the rules bending slightly in his favor was simply how the world worked. "My name is Judge Daniel Whitaker. I have been presiding over cases in this courthouse for more years than I sometimes care to count. Long enough to see people at their worst, and every once in a while at their best. Long enough to know the difference between someone who made a mistake and someone who believes the law is merely a suggestion." And that morning, when that young man spoke those words, something about the tone told me exactly which kind of person I was dealing with. But the truth is, this story is not really about him. It's about the woman standing at the other table. Because, in my experience, the most important stories in a courtroom are rarely about power. They are about perseverance. Before we go further, let me say something to you directly. If you believe that hard work should matter more than status, if you believe that someone who starts with almost nothing deserves the same protection under the law as someone born into privilege, then stay with me. This case reminded me why justice still matters. And if stories like this mean something to you, consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. It helps more people hear stories where fairness actually shows up. Now, back to that morning. It was a Tuesday in early autumn, the kind of morning when the courthouse smells faintly of old wood, floor polish, and paper that has been handled by thousands of hands. I notice that smell every day when I walk through the doors. My father used to say that buildings like this carry the weight of the decisions made inside them. Maybe that's why the air always feels a little heavier. My father was a mechanic, not a lawyer, but he believed deeply in simple rules. One of his favorites was something he told me when I was young. "Danny," he would say, wiping grease from his hands with an old cloth, "the moment a man thinks he's better than everyone else, that's the moment he stops learning." I've remembered those words many times while sitting at that bench. That morning, my clerk was already organizing the day's files when I entered the courtroom. Her name is Margaret Lowe. She has worked beside me for nearly 12 years, and I can read her expressions the way a sailor reads the tide. Margaret always arranges the case folders in perfect stacks, each one aligned with the edge of the desk. She had already set out the morning docket, her glasses resting halfway down her nose as she flipped through the paperwork. When she looked up at me, she gave the smallest shake of her head. That was her quiet way of saying, "This one might be complicated." The first few cases that morning were routine: parking disputes, noise complaints, the ordinary disagreements that fill most municipal courts. People apologizing, people explaining, sometimes people arguing over things that seemed enormous to them and very small to the law. Then Margaret called the next case. The woman stepped forward slowly. She was probably in her early 30s. Her jacket was carefully pressed, but the sleeves showed the kind of wear that comes from years of use. She held a thick folder close to her chest with both hands, as if it contained something precious. In many ways it did. Her name was Elena Morales, and everything she had built in the last 3 years, everything she had worked for, was about to be questioned in that courtroom. Across the aisle, the young man with the confident voice adjusted the cuff of his expensive suit and leaned back in his chair as though the outcome had already been decided. That was the moment I realized this was not going to be an ordinary case. The young man across the aisle did not look worried. In fact, he looked almost bored. I have seen that look before. It usually appears on the faces of people who are used to walking into rooms where things already bend in their direction. He sat with one ankle resting over the opposite knee, gently tapping his finger on the wooden arm of the chair, as if the courtroom was simply another appointment on his calendar. His suit was a deep charcoal color, sharply tailored, the kind of suit that fits perfectly the first day you buy it. When I asked him to stand and state his name for the record, he rose slowly, adjusting his cuffs before speaking. Christopher Hale. His voice carried the smooth confidence of someone who had rarely been told no. Behind him stood his attorney, a tall man with silver hair and a leather briefcase tucked neatly under his arm. The attorney gave a polite nod toward the bench, but Christopher Hale did not bother with anything more than a quick glance. Meanwhile, the woman at the other podium stood quietly with both hands resting on the folder she had brought with her. "Elena Morales," she said, when I asked her to introduce herself. Her voice was steady, though I could see the strain around her eyes. People who walk into courtrooms rarely sleep well the night before. I asked her to tell me, in her own words, what had brought her here. For a moment she hesitated, as if unsure how much of her life could possibly fit into a few sentences. Then she began. 3 years earlier, Elena had been working 2 jobs. Days at a small laundry service folding towels and bed sheets for hotels across the city. Nights at a convenience store where the fluorescent lights buzzed softly above the register. She had a young son at home, Mateo, 8 years old, curious about everything. Some nights she would come home after midnight and find him asleep at the kitchen table with his homework still open in front of him. One evening, while cleaning the shelves in the store where she worked, Elena had an idea. She had always loved baking. Her grandmother had taught her recipes when she was young, sweetbreads, cinnamon pastries, and a simple honey cake that filled the whole house with warmth when it came out of the oven. Elena started experimenting in her small kitchen late at night after work. At first, she baked just a few batches of pastries and brought them to church gatherings and school events. People loved them. One neighbor asked if she could make a tray for a birthday party. Then someone else asked if she could bake for a small office meeting. Eventually, she saved enough money to register a tiny home bakery business. She named it Golden Crumb Bakery, after the golden color her grandmother's honey cakes always had when they finished baking. Every dollar she earned went back into the business. Better ingredients, packaging, a simple logo she designed at the public library using one of the computers there. Little by little, it started growing. By the time she stood in my courtroom that morning, Elena was supplying baked goods to 2 coffee shops and several small weekend markets around the city. It wasn't a large operation, but it was real. It was hers. When she finished speaking, the room was quiet. Then Christopher Hale cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said, "while I appreciate the story, we should probably return to the legal matter." His tone wasn't angry. It was dismissive. He spoke as though the entire explanation we had just heard was a distraction from something more important. I folded my hands together on the bench. "Go ahead," I said. Christopher nodded slightly. "My family owns Hale Hospitality Group," he began. "We operate restaurants and food distribution contracts across the state." His lawyer stepped forward at that point and handed a document to the bailiff, who delivered it to my bench. It was a filing for a product line called Golden Crumbs Artisan Desserts. Christopher continued speaking. "Our company is preparing to launch a national dessert brand. Unfortunately, Miss Morales' little operation is using a name that could create confusion with our trademark." Across the aisle, Elena's fingers tightened around the edge of her folder. Christopher went on. "We attempted to resolve the issue privately," he said. "We even offered compensation to purchase the name and recipe she's been using." I looked up from the paperwork. "How much compensation?" I asked. Christopher paused for just a second. Then he answered, $300. Someone in the gallery shifted in their seat. $300. For the name of a business someone had spent years building. For the recipes passed down through a family. For the work of hundreds of nights spent baking while the rest of the city slept. I turned my attention back to Elena. "Did you receive that offer?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." "And what did you say?" Her answer was quiet. "I told them no." When Elena said those words, The room became very still. I told them no. She did not say it with anger. She did not say it with pride. She said it the way someone describes a simple fact. But I have been on that bench long enough to know that sometimes the smallest sentences carry the greatest weight. Across the aisle, Christopher Hale leaned back slightly, almost amused. His attorney stepped forward again, clearly ready to continue the argument. "Your Honor," the lawyer began smoothly, "my client's company submitted a formal trademark filing months ago. From a legal standpoint, Miss Morales' continued use of the name Golden Crumb Bakery may create commercial confusion." I glanced down at the paperwork again. Then I looked up. "Counselor," I said calmly, "the document in front of me shows that your client filed their trademark application 8 months ago." The attorney nodded. "That is correct." I reached toward the second sheet in Elena's folder, which had already been handed to the bailiff earlier. "This one," I continued, lifting it slightly, "shows that Miss Morales registered the name Golden Crumb Bakery nearly 2 years ago." For the first time, the lawyer hesitated. Christopher Hale shifted in his seat. The room was quiet enough that I could hear Margaret turning a page in her ledger beside me. My father used to tell me that when someone starts losing an argument, they thought they had already won. Their body will reveal it before their mouth does. Christopher's fingers stopped tapping the arm of his chair. I set both documents down. "Miss Morales," I said, "did your business have a permit to sell products at the Riverside Street Market on the day of this incident?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you have that permit with you?" She opened her folder carefully and removed another sheet of paper. Margaret walked it to my bench. The permit was valid, signed, dated. Everything appeared completely proper. And yet, Elena Morales had still ended up standing in a courtroom facing a trespassing complaint. That detail bothered me, so I turned back to Christopher Hale. "Mr. Hale," I asked, "did you personally contact the market organizers about Miss Morales' booth?" He tilted his head slightly. "My company handles matters like that through staff." "That wasn't my question." For a moment, his expression tightened. Then he said, "Yes." "And what exactly did you tell them?" Before he could answer, his attorney spoke again. "Your Honor, the issue here is that our client believed Miss Morales was infringing on a brand identity that Hale Hospitality intends to develop nationally." I leaned back, slightly, believed. That word lingered in my mind, because belief is one thing, evidence is another. At that moment, I asked the bailiff to bring forward the next document that had been submitted to the court earlier that morning. It was a printed record of text messages. They had been obtained legally during a preliminary review by the city's Small Business Oversight Office. I read the first one aloud. "Message sent from Mr. Hale's number to an employee named Victor Trent," I said. The courtroom remained silent. Text reads, "Find out where that bakery woman is selling. If she shows up at Riverside Market, report her. I want her removed before this gets bigger." Christopher's attorney shifted uncomfortably. I continued. Second message, sent 2 days later. "If they say she has a permit, push the complaint anyway. Let the police sort it out." A quiet murmur passed through the gallery. Christopher's jaw tightened. I read the final message. "This is business. She'll give up once it gets expensive enough." I placed the paper back on the bench. In front of me, Elena Morales stood perfectly still. Not triumphant, not angry, just steady. Across the aisle, Christopher Hale looked less relaxed than he had 15 minutes earlier. The tapping finger was gone now. His lawyer leaned close and whispered something urgently. Christopher shook his head once. Then he looked up at me. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "this situation is being exaggerated. We're talking about a tiny local bakery competing with a company that employs hundreds of people." I watched him for a moment. People reveal themselves in moments like that, not with shouting, not with threats, just with quiet assumptions. He truly believed the scale of his company made the outcome obvious. That was when he added one more sentence. This entire case, he said, is a waste of the court's time. Margaret stopped writing beside me. The scratch of her pen vanished. In that silent room, I remembered something my father told me years ago while tightening bolts under the hood of a car. Respect is the one thing money can't buy, Danny. And the moment someone forgets that, they usually learn it the hard way. Christopher Hale was about to learn exactly what my father meant. For several seconds after Christopher Hale said those words, no one in the courtroom moved. This entire case is a waste of the court's time. I have heard frustration in that room before. I have heard anger, fear, even desperation. But there is a certain tone that comes from people who believe consequences are optional. That was the tone I heard. I rested my hands on the bench and looked directly at him. "Mr. Hale," I said quietly, "I want to make sure I understood you correctly." He straightened his shoulders. "You're saying this court's time is being wasted because a small business owner is defending the name she legally registered?" His lawyer shifted slightly beside him, but Christopher answered before the attorney could speak. "What I'm saying," he replied, "is that situations like this usually resolve themselves. My family's company operates on a different scale than a home bakery." There it was again, scale. I have noticed that word comes up often when powerful people try to explain why the rules should stretch around them. I leaned forward slightly. "My father ran a repair shop for 35 years, I said. One garage, 2 lifts, and a coffee pot that never stopped brewing." Christopher didn't respond. "But I remember something he told me once," I continued. "He said the size of a person's business doesn't determine the size of their rights." I paused for a moment and let that settle. Then I turned to Elena. "Miss Morales, please remain standing." She looked surprised but nodded. I turned back toward Christopher Hale. "Now, Mr. Hale, I want to review what has been established in this courtroom today." I lifted the documents on my desk one by one. "First," I said, "Miss Morales legally registered her bakery name nearly 2 years before your company filed anything remotely similar. Second, she obtained proper permits for the market where the complaint occurred. Third, text messages from your own phone indicate that you instructed an employee to file a complaint regardless of whether she had those permits." Christopher's lawyer stepped forward quickly. "Your Honor, those messages can be interpreted in different ways." I raised a hand. "Counselor, I am not finished." The attorney stopped speaking. I continued calmly. "Fourth, the complaint filed against Miss Morales led to police removing her from a market where she had every legal right to sell her products." I set the papers down, "which means this court is not looking at a simple misunderstanding." The room was silent again. Christopher's confident posture had changed. His shoulders were still straight, but his eyes had shifted toward the floor. "Mr. Hale," I said, "I want you to look at Miss Morales." He hesitated. "Look at her." Slowly, he raised his eyes. Elena met his gaze without flinching. In that moment, the contrast between them felt impossible to ignore. One person had built something with long nights and steady effort. The other had tried to erase it with a few messages and a complaint. "Miss Morales," I said gently, "how many hours do you think you have spent building your bakery?" She blinked, surprised by the question. I don't know exactly," she said. "Thousands, probably." "And how many of those hours happened after midnight?" She gave a small, tired smile. "Most of them." I nodded. Then I turned back to Christopher Hale. "Mr. Hale, when someone spends thousands of hours building something honest, the law takes that seriously." His lawyer tried once more. "Your Honor, my client's company is willing to revisit the earlier offer and settle this privately." I shook my head. "That opportunity existed before a false complaint was filed." Christopher finally spoke again. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked. I folded my hands together. "I'm not suggesting anything," I said. "I'm issuing a ruling." The room seemed to lean forward. "First," I said clearly, "all claims against Miss Elena Morales are dismissed in full. She committed no violation, and this court will not allow her record to reflect otherwise. Eleanor's shoulders dropped slightly as if a weight had been lifted. Second, I continued, Mr. Hale, the evidence presented today shows that you directed actions intended to disrupt a lawful business. Christopher looked up sharply. This court finds that conduct unacceptable. I paused long enough for the silence to settle again. Then I finished. You will pay restitution to Miss Morales for the financial losses caused by the market closure, including lost sales and legal costs. Christopher's attorney opened his mouth to object, but I continued. In addition, you will complete 150 hours of community service, assisting small business owners through the city's development program. Christopher stared at me. Community service? Yes, I said. You will spend time helping entrepreneurs who are starting exactly where Miss Morales began. The room remained quiet. Then I added the final sentence. And perhaps during those hours, Mr. Hale, you will learn something that cannot be purchased with a company budget. Courtrooms have a very particular sound when a decision settles into the room. It isn't applause. It isn't celebration. It's a kind of quiet release. After I finished speaking, no one rushed to say anything. Even the people seated in the gallery seemed to understand that the moment deserved a few seconds of silence. Elena Morales stood very still at the podium. Her hands were still resting on that same folder she had carried into the courtroom, but they were no longer gripping it tightly. For the first time since the hearing began, she exhaled slowly. Across the aisle, Christopher Hale sat down again. The confidence he had carried into the room that morning had faded into something quieter, something far less certain. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering instructions about paperwork and timelines, but Christopher barely nodded. Margaret finished writing the last line in her ledger and closed the book with a soft thump. I caught her eye for a moment, and she gave the smallest approving nod. The case was finished. Eleanor gathered her papers carefully and stepped away from the podium. As she passed the benches where several people had been watching, a woman in the second row gave her a gentle smile. It was the kind of smile strangers exchange when they understand that someone just carried a heavy burden for a long time. Outside the courthouse, the late morning sun had warmed the stone steps. Elena paused there for a moment, holding the railing as if grounding herself in the reality of what had just happened. One of the officers told me later that she stood there for nearly 5 minutes before walking to the parking lot. Sometimes justice takes a moment to feel real. The following weekend, Elena returned to the Riverside Street Market. Same folding table, same simple banner that read Golden Crumb Bakery. But this time something was different. Word had spread. Customers who had heard about the case came specifically to buy her pastries. Some brought friends, others brought their children. By mid-morning, the line at her table stretched halfway down the row of vendors. One cafe owner from another part of the city introduced himself and asked about carrying her honey cakes in his shop. Another small grocery market asked if she could supply them once a week. Little by little, the thing she had built during those long nights began to grow, not overnight, but steadily. As for Christopher Hale, his first community service session began about a month later at the city's Small Business Development Office. The director of the program told me afterward that he arrived wearing the same kind of polished suit he had worn in court. At first he seemed uncomfortable answering phones and sorting paperwork for entrepreneurs who were trying to register permits and licenses. But something interesting happened after a few weeks. Instead of standing apart, he began asking questions. One afternoon, he spent nearly an hour listening to a mechanic explain how he was trying to open a second garage, but couldn't afford the permit fees all at once. Another day, he helped a woman organize the paperwork for her small catering company. It turns out that when people sit long enough beside those who are building something from the ground up, their perspective sometimes shifts. I cannot tell you whether Christopher Hale became a different person. That kind of change doesn't happen because of one court order. But I do know this. During those months, he spent time helping people who started with very little and worked very hard. And that is often where understanding begins. Later that same year, Elena Morales mailed a small box to the courthouse. Inside were two neatly wrapped honey cakes and a handwritten note. The note simply said, "Thank you for reminding me that the work mattered." I kept that note in my desk drawer for a long time. Every now and then, when a case grows complicated or discouraging, I think about that morning. I think about the smell of the courthouse when the doors first opened, the quiet scratch of Margaret's pen, and my father's old words echoing in my head. He used to say something else when customers would thank him for fixing a car. Everyone deserves a fair chance to keep moving forward. That idea is simple, but it sits at the heart of every courtroom, because the law was never meant to protect only the loudest voices or the biggest companies. It exists to protect effort. It protects the people who start small. It protects the people who refuse to give up. And sometimes, if the system is working the way it should, it protects a woman who began with a small kitchen, a family recipe, and a dream that no one else believed was worth much at all. Now I'd like to hear from you. Do you think the ruling was fair? Let me know in the comments. And if stories like this remind you why justice still matters, take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Because the next time someone walks into that courtroom believing the rules don't apply to them, I'll be right here at the bench waiting.